Welcome, Photoshop users. Today you are going to learn some basic selection techniques that Photoshop uses. And one of the cool things is this is one of the original Photoshop lessons in the Classroom in a Book series that Adobe created many, many years ago. And so in your source file that's provided to you, you're going to open the Start 01 file. It's going to be located in your source folder. And after you open the file, by the way, you can go to File and do Open or the keyboard command Control O. You're going to open the file and we have it here on the screen. I'm going to do a Control 0 so that makes it fit within the window of my screen. Now, before I begin, I want everyone to go to Window, Workspace, and we're going to reset our workspace so that our screen layout looks exactly like each other's. In previous lessons, you learned about selection techniques and you learned different ways of selecting the tools over here on the left side of your screen on your toolbar. And we talked about that when you click on a tool, the options bar up here will also change according to whatever tool you're on. We want to start by pressing the letter M on the keyboard, and the M pulls up our rectangular marquee by default. And you'll notice that the little triangle in the corner of the marquee shows that there are other tools hidden within that drawer. Now I can either hover click over the tool, I can right click on the tool, or if I use the key Shift and whatever the keyboard command is, like M in this instance, if I do Shift M, it's going to toggle between the two tools. Now, if I'm starting with a selection, and I'm just going to go really quickly for the sake of the demonstration, to select a marquee, I'm just going to click and drag my marquee around it, and I know that the object is selected because I have these little marching ants that appear around whatever I'm working with. To deselect something, I'm going to use the keyboard command Control D to deselect. Now, I want to select this melon, and we're going to practice the elliptical marquee because it's a little bit tricky when you're first learning it. I'm going to Shift M, so I go from my rectangular marquee to my elliptical marquee. And the easiest way to just select a circular object is if you were to imagine where this top line of the shape would intersect with this side over here. It's kind of a corner, imaginary corner. If you start over here and you start to click downward, the shape will get pretty close to what you want. Now you'll see that there's some white area between my marching ants on the left side and the melon, and if I continue to drag, it just makes it kind of bigger. It doesn't really solve the problem. But I'm still holding down my mouse. I'm going to hold and press the space bar on my keyboard, and then I release the space bar, and now the mouse will allow me, I can kind of readjust those marching ants. So I just use the elliptical marquee and the melon as a practice because it's a big object. It makes it a little bit easier to select with when we're practicing. I want to deselect that real quick, so I'm going to Control D, and then I want to switch to the zoom tool. So I'm going to press the letter Z on my keyboard, and the zoom tool, for those of you who are following along and just clicking on the tools, is over here on my toolbar on the left side of my screen. You'll notice that when I click on it, the letter Z is next to the word zoom tool, so that tells me that is the key command to use that. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to triple click on this blueberry. And when I click on it, you'll see up here at the top where my file name is now I have a percentage. And so right now mine's 500%. And that just shows me how far in I'm zoomed in. If I go too far and I click too many zooms and it starts to become pixelated, I can simply do Control minus and maybe another Control minus again, and it zooms me back out. I'm going to go back and click on my M for marquee, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to practice that elliptical marquee selection one more time. So I'm going to click here. I noticed that when I first made my selection, my marquee didn't line up quite right, so I held down the space bar and I made my selection that way. That's a great way. Sometimes it takes a little bit of practice. I'm going to deselect and show you one more trick. If I start in the center of my circle, I'm going to click my mouse, and once I click my mouse, I'm going to hold down the Shift and the Alt key. And as I drag it outward on my screen, it's going to make a perfect circular selection from the center of my whatever I selected on. I'm going to release the mouse, and then I'm going to release the 2 keys. And so that gets me a perfect circle. Either method you use is fine. You just want to try to make sure that you don't get any of the white area outside of the circle. Next, we're going to click on the Move tool, which is the letter V. And when I click on the Move tool, a couple of interesting things I want to point out with Photoshop is usually when you're on one of the tools, the tool icon or cursor will look very similar to the tool. So that gives you kind of a heads up of what you're using. But once I put my cursor inside that selection, Photoshop is telling me what's about to happen. And in this case, I have an arrow that has a little pair of scissors underneath it. And what Photoshop is telling me is if I were to click and drag this selection right now, it's going to cut it from its original location and move it somewhere else. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and I click, and I'm going to move my blueberry down here and try to center it onto the carrot. Now I know that sometimes you want to be creative and make silly faces with your melon head, and we'll definitely have an opportunity to do that later. But for this tutorial, I want you to try to follow along as closely as possible so that I can tell that you are understanding the Photoshop techniques. Another thing to point out on this lesson is that we only have one layer that we're working with. And so what that means is that once I deselect an object, it's going to be melted into that layer. So if I were to deselect my blueberry right now and then realize I need to change it later, anytime I move it after that is going to leave an open cut area within the carrot as well. Right now, I like what I've done with my blueberry, so I'm going to deselect. So now that blueberry has become part of that carrot. I'm going to go back to my marquee tool, which is the letter M, and I'm going to select around the carrot. Now this time I'm going to use the spacebar technique just to help me make sure I'm very, very accurate around the edges. I don't want to get any of the white part around the carrot. Once I have my selection made, I'm going to release the mouse. Now I need to zoom out so I can see everything that's on my canvas. So I'm going to Control 0, and what that does is it's going to zoom out or fit on screen. Now a lot of times when students are first learning how to do Photoshop, they get really excited because they made a selection and they get ready to move an object, and oh my goodness, now what's happened is all I've done is moved the marquee or the marching ants. So Photoshop actually did exactly what you told it to do. You made a marquee and then you moved the marquee, but actually we want to move what's inside the marquee. So to do that, I'm going to come up to my toolbar or click the letter V on my keyboard. They chose V because M was already taken by the marquee, and so I'm going to go back and get my Move tool, and this time I want to make a copy of this blueberry carrot combination. I want to leave the original over here in case I want to use it later. So what I'm going to do, I put my cursor inside that carrot. You'll notice that I get the little scissor icon again, but what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to hold the Alt key with the scissors or with the Move tool. And when I do that, my cursor now becomes a double arrow. So I'm going to click inside there. I'm still holding down Alt, and I'm going to drag it over here to my melon face. I'm going to release the mouse and release Alt, but I am not going to deselect. I want to make an eyeball that's directly across, that's perfectly parallel with the first eyeball. So to do that, this time with still having the Move tool selected, I'm going to hold down Alt, but I'm going to add the Shift key. When I do Alt and Shift with the Move, it's going to constrain my movements so that I can only go directly across from each other. I release my mouse and then I release the keys. Now I have two eyeballs on my screen. If you have messed up somewhere at this point, you can do Control Z over and over again, which is undo, until you get back to a place where you are confident with what your choice was. So I like where my two eyeballs ended up, so I'm going to Control D. The next thing I'm going to do, and I don't care which method you choose, you can do from the inside outward or you can do the diagonal selection, but we're going to use the elliptical marquee one more time, and we're going to select the inside portion of the kiwi. I want to make sure I try not to get the outer brown edge. I'm just going to get the inside of this kiwi. I'm going to switch back to the Move tool with the letter V, and I'm okay cutting this one out, so I'm going to cut it and drag it over here onto the face. Now, while you're on the move tool, if you're trying to make really precise movements and get something to line up perfectly, you can use the arrow keys on your keyboard, and that's called nudging. So you can nudge an object to get a perfect placement if you're having trouble with your mouse control. We're going to deselect. And the next tool that we're going to talk about is the magic wand. We're going to press the letter W on the keyboard, and so that's going to come over here and activate this drawer. I'm going to open it up, and I notice that my magic wand is actually hidden underneath the object selection and the quick selection within that drawer. So I make sure I choose magic wand. And then by default, and I forgot to reset mine when I started this tutorial, by default your tolerance will be set at 32 if you've reset all of your settings. And so 32 means that it's going to get 32 lighter and 32 darker of whatever color I click on. Now, if I were to click on, we're going to talk about this pear-shaped tomato right here, but I'm not zooming in yet so you can see what happens. If I turn contiguous off, and I want you to think about the word contiguous meaning like touching, colors that are touching each other. If I turn off the touching and I click down here, it's going to select all of the colors on my screen that fit within that range. So when I click right here, you'll notice that it gets part of the melon and part of the bow tie, a little bit of the carrot, some of the mushroom down here. But I don't want it to select those objects. I just want to only work with this one object here. So I turn contiguous back on. I'm going to deselect. And now when I click on it, you're going to see that it only gets within those pixels that are touching each other. But you're going to notice that part of the pear-shaped tomato did not get selected. I'm going to zoom in this time, but I don't want to switch tools. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to Control plus, and that moves my screen and zooms in. If I hold down the space bar, my cursor is going to turn into a little hand, and I can click on that hand while I'm holding down the space bar, and it's going to allow me to reposition my Photoshop screen. I'm back on my magic wand, and you'll see that when I have the cursor, it looks like a little magic wand up here. I want to increase my tolerance so I have a broader range of colors. I'm going to increase my tolerance to 50, and this time I'm going to deselect. And when I click back on it, a little bit more of the color was selected. But instead of trying to play with the tolerance tool and go back and forth with it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down the Alt key. And this is really cool about Photoshop. Right now it shows me the magic wand. If I hold down my, I want to add, so I'm going to use Shift. Sorry. So if I hold down my Shift key, I notice this is really cool. It's going to give me a little magic wand with a plus. And so what that's telling the user is whatever you click on, it's going to add to your selection. So I'm going to click right here, and then I'm going to click one more time inside that highlight, and now I have a perfectly pear-shaped tomato. And I know it's not red, so some of you may be saying, hey, that's not a tomato, but that's what they called it in the tutorial. I'm going to Control 0 to fit back on screen, and I'm going to click my Move tool. I'm going to click inside this pear-shaped tomato, and I'm going to drag it over here and place it on the face. Now, if you're trying to follow the video and the tutorial that I made that's in your classroom setting, we are already all the way down to page 4 of the tutorial. We're about halfway down. And the next step that we're going to do is actually the last step in today's lesson. We're going to Control D to deselect. And we're saving the hardest part for last. So I'm going to click on my zoom tool, and I'm going to zoom in really, really tight on this bow tie pasta. Okay, and this bow tie pasta is kind of complicated because the top and the bottom part of the bow tie pasta are curved, but then we have these really nice sharp corners and angles that we want to keep looking really nice. So I'm going to use a combination of selection tools. I'm going to press the letter L on my keyboard, and L is going to bring up my lasso drawer. Okay, and you've learned that the lasso tool is a freehand tracing thing, but I'm going to do a little squiggle right here. But the lasso tool is sometimes really difficult to control if you're using your mouse, and so sometimes it gives you really weird, awkward selections. I'm going to deselect that. But what I want to do is I want to trace along the top part of this bow tie with my lasso, and it's okay if it's not perfect. because we're still learning, but I want to be able to tell that you're using the correct tools. So listen to me carefully on this part of the tutorial because it is a little bit complicated. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to hold down my mouse and I am dragging across, dragging across this bow tie. Now, for me, I'm using the touchpad on a laptop, so that's really, really difficult right now. So let's deselect that and try to do it a little bit better. I said we didn't have to be perfect, but gosh, that was pretty rough. Okay, so I'm dragging right here and I get to the corner. I'm not going to let go of my mouse. If I do, it's going to connect back to where I started, and that's not what I want to have happen. I'm going to hold down my Alt key, and I'm going to leave my finger pressed on Alt until I give another direction that says not to. I'm going to release the mouse, and when I do release it, you're going to notice that that lasso now turned into a polygonal lasso. The polygonal lasso is just used for sharp edges and corners. So what I'm going to do, I'm not dragging my mouse, but I'm simply moving the mouse and clicking the button on all of the corners and the angles. So I'm going through and I'm doing this. You can go kind of quickly because it's basically like connect the dots. And the way that I tell if you've used the right tool is you're going to have really, really sharp points that a normal lasso would not give you. Now I get to this corner and I need to switch back to my regular lasso. So what I'm going to do, I'm still holding down my Alt key with my index finger. I'm going to click my mouse, and you'll see that when I click and I hold down that mouse, I'm holding it down. Now it turns into the little lasso icon. So now that it's that way, I can release the Alt key and I'm just going to drag across here. And sometimes if you drag kind of quickly, the line gets smoother. Now when I get here to the corner, I'm going to go back and I'm going to hold down Alt. I'm going to release my mouse, and so it turns back into a polygonal lasso. And then I'm going to play another little game of connect the corners or connect the dots. And so I get straight lines and really, really sharp edges. If you were to click and drag the mouse right now instead of clicking and just clicking on the corners, if you click and drag, it's actually going to go back to the regular lasso. When you get back to the starting place, what you want to do is you want to overlap. We're going to click, and so now it's going to connect my starting and my ending position. Pause the video for this moment. You may need to rewind it a couple of times. Watch the video over and over again. Once you have a nice looking bow tie shape, we're going to Control 0 to zoom out. We're going to use our Move tool. Move that bow tie pasta, and we are going to place it right here under his chin. Now this is a bow tie. This is all we have to do for day one. So I'm going to Control D to deselect, and I want to name this file. I'm going to go to File, Save As, because I'm naming this something new and I'm putting it in a new location. If you try to save your file and you get an error message, it's probably because you're opening it from a source folder that belongs to your teacher, and you probably do not have the access to write in that file. So we go to File, Save As, or Shift Control S. I'm going to click on that. You're going to go to wherever your folder is that you want to save your work at, and I'm going to save mine in my logos folder. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename it. I'm going to call it Your Name Melon PSD. So your name underscore or a hyphen and then melon. So I'm going to save it. I actually had saved one earlier, so I'm going to override that. It's going to say, do you want to replace it? I'm going to say yes because I like this one better. This is the end of day one's tutorial. And so this is where you should be by the end of day one.